Thanks, Hazel, for setting the scene. Would you like to take one of the chairs as well? Welcoming up Oktay and Stuart and Madeleine and Suraj. That was great. Thanks, Hazel. And we talked about PETRAS and the PETRAS letters Rachel discussed R earlier. The A is acceptability, but equally it could be adoption. And I think that's one of our themes here. We have the technology, but in that socio-technical setting, is it being used and is it being used effectively? I'm going to hand over to Oktay.
So, hi everyone, welcome again. I first would like to thank Hazel for the keynote. So before we start our discussion on resilient global supply chains, I would like to ask our panel members to briefly introduce themselves. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. My name is Stuart Chalmers, and I'm the head of digital products and data science for the National Physical Laboratory. So the National Physical Laboratory is the UK's National Measurement Institute. So we realise and manage the standards for measurement, so things like the definition of a second or a metre or a kilogram. And also we look at the calibration of instruments against those standards, so we try and calibrate instruments so that people can have a level of confidence in the accuracy of what's being measured.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Madeleine Carr. I'm Professor of Global Politics and Cybersecurity at University College London. Used to be in the same department with Jeremy, where all this began. I was the lead on the Standards Governance and Policy stream in the original incarnation of PETRAS, and I've remained engaged ever since, really. And in my work and in my research team and in my teaching, we very much focus on this socio-technical interface of cybersecurity in various forms.
Hello everyone, I'm Siraj Sheikh. I'm a professor in system security at Swansea University, interested in issues of cyber-physical systems in terms of economics and supply chains as well, particularly in the transport sector, but also looking at semiconductors and secure hardware in these sectors as well.
And you know me, hopefully.
Okay, thank you all. So let's start with making the scene. Global supply chains have been struggling with, well, historically and systematically, struggling with many challenges, and disruptions are one of them, one of the major, actually, challenges. And there are so many reasons for that. And for example, geopolitical events, some economic instabilities, or natural disasters. And what we do is we adapt technologies, right? So we make things digitized, we automate things to mitigate these issues, but well, through increasing the transparency or efficiency increment or risk mitigation and so on. But while doing that, increasing actually digitized systems or adapting technology come with some challenges, right? Because nothing actually comes with at no cost. So doing this thing is actually meaning that we are removing human from the equation. So again, which makes systems or things, processes susceptible to some challenges. So that brings us to, like, two questions for the panel. So the first one, can technology really replace human skills? And if yes, where? And the second one, how can unintended consequences, like occurring due to this adoption of technology, like cyber threats, can be avoided when implementing these new technologies?
Yeah, so for us at NPL, like I say, we calibrate and provide that trust in our accuracy in, say, instruments or systems. And increasingly, we're looking at nearer real-time calibration of those systems. So whereas previously we would take an instrument or something into a laboratory, we would test it maybe for a couple of weeks, and then we'd give it back to the owner. We actually test, or we're looking more now at testing in situ or testing with real-time data. But that brings, for us, some challenges because obviously the level of accuracy of the tests that we do has to change, because sometimes we have to just look at the data as it's coming through and be sort of preemptive. So say, actually, is there something happening or is there something wrong there? So that can, and we do already use a lot of automation in that process. So a lot of what we do is done with complex software simulations, but in specific cases, we absolutely still have to have a human in that chain. So for instance, if we're auditing or calibrating an advanced radiotherapy device that's administering a dose of radiation to a patient, we need to have some form of confidence that that's going to be correct. So yeah, and in terms of like unintended sort of consequences or things that brings about, increasingly we're using data that we've gathered plus machine learning to help us do that sort of prescriptive or preemptive sort of work. But we have to be really careful that we get data that's not biased or data that we can actually trust. So we have to be able to trust the data to be able to trust what we are actually going to, calibrate or verify or give somebody a level of confidence in.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think. I think Hazel's speech actually set this up really well, because I would say that of course technology can replace humans in some contexts. That's almost what technology is. We develop a tool or a system to address a human-defined problem, and that's what we use it for. But it can only do it up to a point. So what Hazel was talking about, these relationships in the supply chain that aren't easily replicated by technological assurance programs. I would say in geopolitics as well, that really, to a certain extent, the kind of negotiations that we depend upon do come down to human beings and to human relationships. Even in the security sector, we've done a lot of work, again, through PETRAS on cyber emergency response teams at the global level and how they coordinate between themselves in an incident, when an incident occurs. And we did a lot of interviews with those people, and they would say absolutely their relationships are professional, but personal relationships. Actually, I mean, they told us that they would go to one another's weddings to that extent, and that christenings and things. So if they leave that position, that organization that they worked for no longer has that network. That relationship goes with the human being. So I think maybe it's this thing of trust, the T in PETRAS, that can't be always replaced by technology.
Thank you. So I'm trying to make an argument here, which has not been said already. I think there's been already, what's been said is wonderful. So I focus a lot on safety critical systems, and in terms of their security. And if you look at safety, and now increasingly the security case, so the safety case, which is then becoming the basis for a lot of type approval or regulatory approval for these systems in various domains, whether it's transportation or energy or other systems and so on. And now the security case as well. And I'll use an academic terminology here because we have got lots of academic colleagues. The epistemology of a safety case is human expertise and human insight, alongside some benchmarks, which means that essentially the claim and the evidence made to support that claim in any safety case for regulatory approval is essentially some reference to some benchmark, some data that may come out of NPL or other bodies and so on, or a crash test in case of a vehicle. But then the argument made essentially is the expertise and insight. So that is very important in terms of no matter how sophisticated we get with our manufacturing and design and approval, ultimately that safety case and security case that becomes the point of approval is based on human expertise and human insight. It's just because it's so complex. And we've seen safety in the aerospace sector where one of the world's biggest companies and most innovative in terms of Boeing got it wrong with safety, right? So we saw that example, and there were lots of interesting lessons. So these notions are very complex, and I think all this concern around that humans will be detached away or from machines and so on, or due to automation, I think we don't need to worry about that as much. And one final thing to say, just in terms of AI and everything else, if you've used any of these large language model apps and so on, you would realize that we're still getting the basic facts wrong as well and so on. So I wouldn't worry about it as such at the minute.
I think I probably answered it pretty much in my speech. What I do think, particularly in my sector, what technology and data is very helpful for is giving trends and helping businesses make decisions based on evidence and trends. But when it actually comes down to sort of understanding what the issues really are, you still have to have that conversation, because you're dealing with people, and you just can't boil that down to sort of numbers or figures on a page.
Okay, great. So I think I can conclude that we all agree this technologies, adoption of new technologies are critical to resolve issues, for example, increasing efficiencies and so on. But they are not at the stage that they can completely unseat human from the loop, because we are still indispensable. But again, while doing that, they are bringing their own challenges as well, so that will need some time and so on. So, great. So I would like to ask about your thoughts on the challenges in relation to timelines and investment. So what do you think about the pace of technology in terms of meeting the demand in this particular field, and what are your thoughts on continuous assurance and compliance in relates to global supply chains?
You're the timing guy.
Oh. Well, I think one of the answer I gave before, I guess, applies here in terms of we try to assure against specific standards, but actually, if we're dealing with real-time data, we have to look at the standards that we're assuring against, or we're certifying or calibrating against. And specifically, I guess, because sometimes when we are, for instance, calibrating an instrument that goes into a supply chain or goes into a system, we tend to do it to a really specific level of tolerance. But actually, increasingly, you may not need that level of tolerance. So you may have, for instance, a weather sensor, but if the weather sensor has to tell you exactly how many millimeters of rain have fallen, then we do have to calibrate it to a certain point. If it just has to tell you that it's wet or it's dry, then we don't need to calibrate or have that level of confidence in it. So I think for us, it's the big thing is the shift to real-time analysis is a big thing for us. And I think it's probably something that will really change the way we look at the standards that we measure against. Yep.
I mean, I guess my interest in this would be predominantly from a business perspective and a policy perspective. And I would say for the business sector that apart from large, sophisticated organizations, that there's still a pretty significant lack of understanding about the supply chain for a lot of private sector organizations beyond those kind of primary relationships, the ones that they buy from and the ones that they sell into. But further up and down that supply chain, I think that there's still kind of maybe we could say like this veil of ignorance, would rather not go there or probe too deeply. And I think this, again, Hazel, you made this point about saying that businesses are either or will need to take responsibility for this supply chain with regard to the forestry piece. And I think that also will come in places like the UK, where there's going to be more emphasis on business leaders actually digging a bit deeper and understanding what is the ecosystem of the supply chain that they sit in, and have they taken steps to responsibly protect their organizations. And then from a policy perspective, the pace of change is just, I mean, we've had these discussions over the last sort of 5 or 7 years, but the pace of change is very unsuited to the kind of careful, deliberate, policy-making process that we rely upon in a kind of a democracy like the UK. And it's very often criticized for not being agile enough and, being too slow and always behind the ball. But that's because we have these levels of accountability and transparency and care and thought that go into it. But nonetheless, we'd have to say it's not well suited to the challenges that policymakers face now. And I think some of the most exciting work in innovation and technology will be in innovation and policy, in technology policy. So how can we do that better through, all kind of devices like regulatory sandpits and stress testing and things like that. I mean, Andreas Hagman is here who works in that space exactly, would have lots of ideas on it. But I think that's actually a space for real innovative, creative thinking that we haven't really tapped into that much.
I think that's true in terms of, I know that a lot of our work is looking at the very low level sort of data that comes from sensors or that, but actually aggregating that up to look at it at different levels and to be able to not just aggregate the data but interpret the data in terms of what it means at the different levels of a supply chain in terms of the hierarchy in it is really important.
Yeah.
I don't think I can, once again, I can add much on this. I think just picking up on supply chains, I just want to make one economic point. The point about globalization and offshoring and then onshoring now is a very important one, particularly in the semiconductors industry, and particularly because there are national security imperatives, but also kind of, various supply chain resilience imperatives as well and so on. But there's something we've got to remember, which is very important. Good organizations, particularly in complex supply chains, once again, we take engineering as a sector as example, automotive or rail or other sectors and so on, they would worry about the financial health of their suppliers in terms of their tier suppliers or their customers, so they can adjust their market strategy. So a company that is competitive in terms of security, first and foremost, they would be worried about being competitive economically. And that's very important to understand. So if we want to create a resilient supply chain which is trusted, we need to be able to also establish that that supply chain is economically competitive and has the right market case and commercial sustenance and independence, for it to survive and thrive, and for us to then have a set of integrated systems that we can then kind of have confidence in and so on. And that is something that is often overlooked, I think, in the language of whether it's policy or whether it's a security language, because very often we kind of ignore that. And I think in the UK, when we've started doing the integrated review, which reviews across international trade, foreign policy, national security, and so on, that's the starting point, to understand that we have to look across those policy areas. Now, there may be opposition to that from various political perspectives, but I think it's important for economic security and hence, therefore, national security and cybersecurity.
I completely agree with that. And what I was thinking, what came to mind when I was listening to the panelists is in Germany at the beginning of the year, something called the German Supply Chain Act came into force. And it's really interesting seeing the impact that's having on businesses who are having to, by the end of the year, get ready to comply. And again, lots of technologies are coming in to say, we can show you how you comply with the Act. A lot of legal companies partnering as well, developing new systems. But again, when it comes down to it, it is still all about the people and relationships. And businesses are getting quite nervous about what they're going to have to share transparently. So if they're sourcing from parts of the world that are in conflict or where there's serious human rights abuses, they are actually going to have to to declare that. They now no longer will be able to sort of, hide it anywhere. And so I think I keep an eye on that if you're interested in the subject, because I think at the end of the year, we'll start to see their reports and see what sorts of things big automotive companies, for example, are talking about. But the other big part is around purchasing practices, which is such a dry, boring way to describe buyer-supplier relationships. But actually, that is and I think that links to what you're saying, is about actually making sure that, those buyers at the top are thinking about the success and the resilience of the suppliers in their, they've got the skin in the game. They're going to have skin in the game to make sure that they're successful for the long term.
Can I just add a couple of examples? Just 2 examples, and sometimes it can be very trivial, something incredibly trivial. Quite a few years ago, I spoke to British Transport Police, and I particularly was focusing on parts of transport infrastructure around rail and so on. And I went in as a computer science prof, and I said, "What's your most, sophisticated digital crime?" And I wasn't ready for the answer, and they said, "Copper theft."
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes it could be very trivial. And one more example. The largest automotive OEM in Europe relied on wiring harnesses. So wiring harnesses are essentially structures that go in the vehicle to support the wiring. And predominantly, most of their wiring came from one country, Ukraine. And at that point, obviously, no one had factored in that in the 21st century, where we are, we would have a war right on our doorstep. So then, and I'm sure if you Google it, you'll find out who they are and so on. And the CEO made some silly comments as well, and there were various corporate changes because of that as well. So that's something to think about. Sometimes it's these things are, the supply chain is very diverse and complex, and sometimes there are very simple things that perhaps very major industries rely on, and we just have to factor all of them in.
I have seen, though, that the situation in Ukraine has actually made procurement teams sit up and think, where else? What might the next one be? And I wouldn't say it's perfect by any means, but they're definitely starting to think a bit more long term. And also climate, the issue of climate change on the supply chains is also making people start to look at that 5, 10, even 20-year trajectory, which I've been trying to get companies to do for a long time, and it is starting to happen more.
Great. Thank you very much for your invaluable insights. So I would like to talk more about the future. So the question will be, how can the UK contribute to building resilience on global supply chains? So this is not a very particularly hot area that attracts actually new talent. So what are your thoughts on how we can actually train and attract people to push through change and are globally competitive?
Should we go the other way? Go in the other direction?
Oh, no. Oh, God, it's a hard one for me to answer because I'm spending so much of my time working on European legislation. But what's fascinating is that most British companies are having to prepare for it anyway, because either they're just saying, well, we'll be benchmarked against the types of NGOs or scorecards that they have to go through. We're going to have to do it anyway. So they're all preparing, for that legislation, whether we have to go through it or not. I mean, I personally, and I've worked in supply chains for 20 odd years, it's really exciting, attractive roles. If I would encourage my children to go and work in that. So, because it's really interesting, you get to travel, you get to meet people from all walks of life. It's a bit of engineering, it's a bit of design. If you could really make it a much more attractive industry if you wanted, and actually the whole piece around sustainability and climate is all there. So it could be, if you think about the profession, and I'm probably thinking it from that soft skills type of view, it could be genuinely revolutionised. No one grows up today thinking, I want to be a procurement manager. But actually it is quite interesting. I think it's genuinely an interesting place to be.
Well, I was just going to say, I think this is this is the question for Mike Short, who's here in the morning,
Yeah.
as ex-CSA for for DIT. Sorry, I just want to mention one thing with security at least, and once again, contrasting with safety. I've been on a learning curve. I think Madeline reminded me this morning as well in terms of a startup and trying to go and sell, security, as it were. So security has a kind of a challenge in terms of a business case. But going back to a lot of the industries we've talked about in terms of C&I, OT industries, but also, automotive, rail, other industries, and so on. And I say this with a lot of confidence. Safety is a value proposition for a lot of companies. Security, as yet, is not a value proposition for a lot of companies. Security is about risk management, and it's about threat actor mitigation or risk mitigation and so on. All these very violent, depressing terms, right? Whereas safety is about saving human lives and liberating us from the worries of uncertainty and so on. Once again, very positive words. So safety has had that journey. But I do believe that we will get to a point where security will become a value proposition, and I think this is exactly where perhaps Britain has a role to play. We are when we compare ourselves to a lot of competitors, we're very good at innovation, novelty, original ideas, a great university network, a great place for a number of inventions that have come about. And so we may not have the market size for it and so on, but the point is, and a trusted brand as well in many respects. So, perhaps that is one way where we can establish ourselves and make security a value proposition, a competitive advantage proposition for a lot of our enterprises and the private sector. But I strongly believe that unless we think about the economics as much as we think about security and that competitiveness, unless we take both of them along, amongst other things, of course, unless we do that, we will struggle.
So now we're going in this order. There's nothing for me to say. No, I was thinking along the same lines, actually. And I was reading just the other day, Rachel Reeves, the shadow treasurer, her concept of securonomics and how security and economics for the future of the UK is going to be so, intrinsically connected. And we need to think about it at a domestic level and also an international level. But I've also been talking with people and doing a little bit of work on this idea that we could look at what the business case for security is, and in particular for SMEs, which are really the leaky boat for the UK economy in terms of cybersecurity. Because if you think about the many startups and SMEs that are, we have this business model now of startup, build, and exit. And at 2 points there's a case for security, and particularly as UK PLC becomes more educated about these supply chain vulnerabilities and supply chain threats. And that's at the venture capital stage, where a smart venture capitalist will begin to ask questions about what they are investing in. And at the exit stage, where the price of that a business can attract upon exit, really should be materially affected by the security that's in place in that organization, because no one wants to buy a cybersecurity vulnerability. Or, well, if they do, they want to know about it and they would like to adjust the price accordingly. Like companies like BA that bought that, what was it, a hotel chain, I don't know, 4 years ago or so, and incurred the biggest fine in the UK for that. I mean, it was adjusted later, but so I think there actually are ways to think about that business case in UK PLCs, and I think that is the kind of thing that the UK is good at, because we have relatively cohesive kind of community here between the policy community and the business sector.
I would say that the thing that's grown for us is the idea that increasingly we're looking at the data that we gather rather than the actual physical, the physical calibrations of things that we do, and then how the data, as we said, aggregates up. And well, the security for us is important. One of the things is that as we increase using things like machine learning or AI, we have to be able to explain what we do. So explain so that we get a level, so we still maintain that level of trust in what we do. I think somebody earlier on had been talking about the sort of lamppost coming out of the ground. Why would you trust what's there? So for us, we've found a lot of the times that if we say that it's from AI, which is essentially a black box, we don't have that trust in it, and we can't give that confidence that what we're doing is correct. But if we can, and we have been looking at explainability of AI algorithms, if we can do that, and even if they don't like what the outcome is, if we can explain why that outcome happened, either through because the data set was valid and the data set was distributed fairly or didn't have any bias in it, then I think that's increasingly what we've been looking at.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are just on time, and now it's for Q&A time. Questions? Yeah, you can go with Rachel.
I'm trying to work out what I'm asking here. I think Hazel and Madeline alluded to it, but actually, and you've talked about resilience and you've talked about mainly security, but I want to come back to that PETRAS logo thing, the words. Don't you think that actually any organisation or any system need to take all of those into account, because what you're talking about is reputation management. If your supply chain security is important, the resilience is important, but actually ethics and privacy and all those things are important in the global supply chain. I'm thinking here about health, the health supply chain, thinking about what happened in COVID, and in the future, where will the end of the supply chain be? Will it be in my body, and will it be data collected from my body as a result of some drug I've taken? And how does that go down the supply chain? So I'm just thinking about the forests where things are extracted, or the mines, or wherever. So what, the extent of that supply chain, and the word that we haven't got in PETRAS is responsibility. Mm-hmm. Where does that responsibility lie? So I'm just sort of asking that question. PETRAS is in everything, isn't it, in that sense? And how do we start to get people to think about that, really?
Yeah.
Is that a philosophical discussion?
I mean, I'm definitely seeing there is a shift, and I think what you're saying is right. So particularly in the field I work in, as I said, that businesses have always been looking at their suppliers, but never really thinking about their customers and the sort of impact. So I think sort of what you're saying is they're starting to think about it. I'd say slowly, but if you're a big company selling sweets, for example, what is your responsibility when it comes to sort of the obesity crisis, and I am starting to see people sort of trying to build human rights into product design and into what they're starting. It's slow. There's not that many good examples of it, but I think it's coming slowly. Yeah.
I was thinking, if the data collection
yeah.
goes all the way through,
Yeah.
where does it end? So that's
Yeah.
Hi there. This is much more simple, I think. I'd love to know the panel's thoughts on software supply chain, given the increased digitalization that we're seeing, and whether there are any significant differences or perhaps more challenges or less challenges in a software supply chain. I suppose you don't really have to either like globalize or onshore. It can be anywhere in the world, but what about other things? Are there any other differences?
Okay.
No, you go ahead, Suraj. I'll jump in after you.
Thank you. So I think there are a couple of things just to say. Could I also just address the earlier point, just very quickly? I was going to say, sorry, that's fine. If I had to choose of one thing to do beyond just standards and political pressure and so on, and I think this is a message for PETRAS as well, the one thing I would love to do and would absolutely keep it the top priority is educating the consumer. I think that really helps in a number of ways, in terms of what democratic kind of then influence they have, what market they create, and so on. And something similar to this question as well. So the one challenge with software, of course, is the assurance of it is very difficult. As a product, it's a very difficult thing to get right, and it's one of the, when we talk about software safety or security and so on, we take automotive, we have crash tests, we have years of understanding and consumer championing and everything else and so on. But that challenge, I think, around the product itself is a problem, I think. And the other thing around consumers as well, software is a very strange, in terms of mass consumer market, it's a very strange proposition where we've all accepted the fact that this is the one product when we buy, it's out of date at the point of sale. So when we buy it, the first thing it does is update because it's out of date by then. And we've kind of accepted this. I mean, imagine going into and buying a washing machine and say, oh, well, this is half broken. By the time you get home, it'll be fixed. Or the new Audi you're buying, and it says, well, the brakes don't work, but by the time you drive back, they'll be okay. They'll be updated. I mean, mind boggles. Why do we accept that? If you take a very famous spreadsheet, I'm not going to take the name, but you read the terms and conditions, and I have, alongside the help of a student, it takes no responsibility for any accountancy failure. Absolutely. So if you're doing your tax returns on that big spreadsheet, don't use an accountant. At least the liability is covered. So the point, so that's what I do. So the point is, we should, as the consumer, we should just absolutely, create an environment and a market and demand better software. And so what does that mean in terms of, the two things are perhaps a contradiction because it's very difficult to get right as well. It just perhaps means some balance somewhere where at least the software industry takes that responsibility, I think, that a lot of other sectors and industries do.
I mean, I think for us, increasingly, we've been looking at the use of machine learning and AI algorithms as bits of software. But that again, if we're looking at that, and we've got we're looking at it as part of a whole supply chain or system that's across borders. There's different regulations from, different countries have different regulations. And even down to the idea that if we've got an algorithm and there is some form of certification of that algorithm, if it's got some form of machine learning or AI in it, depending on the data that you use to train that algorithm, you can get completely, there's no validation of the answers that are output from it. If you give it skewed data or wrong data, you can get the wrong answers out. So we've been, I guess it's a problem we've been looking at. Yeah.
Can I just add something on that, Oktay? Because I think the two questions are related, actually, in the sense that, as Siraj says, we're very accepting of this. We could say there's no real market driver for secure software. There's you can write secure software, of course. I'm sure the software that they use to send the rocket to the moon is secure because they take years and years and years to get it right. But there's no market for that. And Melissa Hathaway, who was President Obama's cybersecurity advisor, said at a conference once, she said, there's nothing wrong with the cybersecurity market. It works perfectly. You have on one side vendors pushing out insecure products all the time, every day, and you have on the other side those vendors that come along to mop up after and find solutions, and they're symbiotically reliant on one another. So it's working great, But this is a market that there isn't a market driver to invest that time, and this comes back to Rachel's point about what's the actual end goal here. and if we remember that it's everything in PETRAS, I would say it's the betterment of the human condition. That's why we have technology. That's the whole point. It's not, I mean, if you have a business, of course it's to make money. But this is where I think that the policy community is so important, because I'm not sure that you can educate customers out of insecurity. But I think that the policy, the government has a real role to play in stepping in and ensuring that where there's no market driver, there's some other driver.
Just wanted to make a quick comment on the software point, because I think partly the answer to your question is something you mentioned in the previous panel. One of the things I'm responsible for is something called the UK Software Sustainability Institute. So we help academia, higher education, with research software quality, essentially. And one of the questions that comes up a lot these days are, what are we doing with machine learning? Well, the answer is the same as with other software. The quality of things are the same. The new issue is the thing you mentioned in the previous panel, which is software bill of materials. So when we get into the software supply chain, and there's a whole other panel discussion we could have, or perhaps we'll do later, about the IoT supply chain. And I'm sure Suraj, with the semiconductor industry as well, will have a lot to say about that. And perhaps we'll do that upstairs in a minute. Back to you, Octave.
One last question, maybe, because I think we are running out of time. Yes, please.
Yeah, supply chain security is critically important for the ecosystem. You mentioned that it's very complex. So we might have not just supply chains, we have supply network and hierarchical network with different levels. So, and also involve different domains. So might the regulation for different domains have different requirements? How can we make the the ecosystem resilient? But the first need to combine all the requirements of the different regulation for different domains. How can we deal with this?
Maybe AI? No.
AI.
I don't know.
For us, we have part of it, the data science team that we have look at classification of information. So just at the purely implementation level, we do look at using ontologies to classify information and to classify it into different categories, where we can then apply different rules to those sort of categories of information. But I think it's a wider point than that.
Thank you very much. I think this concludes our panel. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.